Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm joined again with Stuart Sanders, a great Kentucky author. How's it going?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is round 3, I believe, of your podcast appearances. You're becoming a regular. As long as you keep the books coming out, I think we'll be able to hold your spot.
Third time's a charm.
Yeah. Now, we talked about, Civil War battles and a few of your books on that, but this is a bit of a different book. The book is called The Murder on the Ohio Belle. A different genre, I guess, in a sense. I mean, it's still history, but a different focus, I guess. That probably better said that way. Typically, you've kind of stuck to Civil War, but a little bit of a different book. Tell us a brief mention about it.
Yeah, sure. This, I guess it's sort of historic true crime is kind of the best way to summarize it. But it looks at a murder, or a couple of murders actually, that took place on a steamboat called the Ohio Belle in March of 1856. So it sort of examines a number of themes through the lens of those murders, including, Southern honor culture, vigilante justice, murder, and a few other themes as well. And, I touched on the Civil War in there a bit too. So it, encompasses a lot of different history, all seen through the lens of this steamboat that was called the Ohio Belle. And the boat was kind of, it ran passengers and freight from Cincinnati down to New Orleans and back. And so it was a fairly well-known boat, based in Cincinnati. And, again, in 1856, it sort of endured great tragedy on board when these couple of murders and a bit of vigilante justice also took place.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you think about steamboats in 1856, steamboats. I mean, this is big time transportation. The railroad hasn't really came into town yet. So really, when you think about a steamboat, was kind of I wouldn't say luxury, but kind of an important, high up there kind of a mode of transportation.
Yeah, definitely. It was sort of the most luxurious mode of transportation. In 1856, though, it was sort of soon to be taken over by railroads. But, at the time, these boats really prided themselves on being luxurious, and boats would compete with each other. Not only which boat has the best accommodations, but also which were the fastest between 2 points. And that's one way they sold tickets. Unfortunately, a lot of the times, pilots and engineers were taking a lot of risks with the boilers, and as they tried to get really fast speed, they would sort of make decisions that sort of put the lives of the crew and passengers in peril. So, a lot of times explosions took place because boats were, running with too much steam, for example, or they were throwing things in the boilers to get, the boiler's really hot to produce more steam, and that would end up causing explosions. So, the crazy thing about steamboat travel is that the average boat on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers only lasted about an average of 5 years. So, a lot of times they would fall victim to fires or, snags in the river that would end up sinking them, or these terrible explosions that took place literally up and down, the rivers. Every year there were multiple horrific explosions, and that's something I chronicled a little bit in this book too.
Well, that was the question I was thinking. How often does an accident happen? But quite a bit, I mean, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, at
No,
least every month during this period, just going through
oh
historic
gosh.
newspapers. Yeah, I mean, you'd find, and sometimes it was a fire on board that didn't cause any casualties.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was the boat, sinking and they were able to get it, sort of steer it back over towards shore. But, again, in some of these instances, dozens and dozens of people were killed in these explosions. The Ohio Belle actually, there were three boats named the Ohio Belle that ran from, the late 1830s until really the end of the Civil War. That's when sort of the third boat, and that was the boat that the murders took place on. Um, you know, Probably the first and second boats, one of them fell victim to a fire, probably, we think. And every time one of the boats would get destroyed, investors would just build another boat and would slap the same name on it as a way to sort of keep the reputation going. So, it was sort of a little trick of the trade. Once a boat had established some notoriety, for good accommodations and sort of luxurious accommodations, they would keep the name the same as a way to keep, pulling passengers in. But again, it really was the reputation of the pilots and the reputation of the boat that sold tickets. And so, if people could shave off some time between, Louisville and St. Louis, for example, they would try to get on the fastest boat. But sometimes that had, really dire consequences for people if the pilots and engineers were taking too many risks.
Well, I kind of, wondered, like, you know, if there's a bunch of trash talking back and forth between who's got the best boat and all that.
Probably,
Well,
yeah. I mean, it was a huge business. Um, it made a lot of difference in business. Imagine if we were flying from, Cincinnati to London, England, for example, and you could make the trip 2 hours shorter. You'd
yeah,
buy a ticket, on that faster
yeah.
plane if you could. But unfortunately, again, these terrible accidents sometimes took place. But the third Ohio Belle, miraculously, that never happened. Instead, it fell victim, to these murders on board, and also the Civil War. During the war, both sides ended up using it as a hospital boat, as a transport ship, and other things too. So, the boat itself has a pretty fascinating history, and so it was fun to kind of dig into that and kind of treat the boat as a character in the book, actually. When I was researching and writing it, so I see the steamboat, the Ohio Belle, as being, if not the main character, one of the top three characters in the book.
Yeah. Well, so like as far as these murders go, um, let's get into them. Pretty
Sure.
interesting stuff. Pretty um, unique stories, I guess I should say, right? Um,
Yeah, and I sort of uncovered the story. I was actually researching another book project. I've got a book coming out in November of 2023 about a duel that was fought in Kentucky during the Civil War between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. And so that book sort of looks at um, the secession crisis and sort of how violence changed in Kentucky over time through the lens of that duel. But in this book, I was researching that book, rather, the duel book, and stumbled upon a newspaper article from 1856 where authorities had fished a dead man out of the Mississippi River who'd been tied to a chair. And I thought, God, this is really terrible. What happened to this poor guy? Why was he tied to a chair and obviously thrown into the river to drown?
mhm.
And who did this to him? So I had all these questions that came to mind. So I started, as we nonfiction writers do, start pulling that one thread, and more threads start kind of coming out. And I soon, found this sort of murder story that nobody had really looked at, or was, kind of a long forgotten murder. And essentially what happened in March of 1856, there was a Mississippian who called himself J.B. Jones, who boarded the steamboat Ohio Belle at Smithland, Kentucky, which is near Paducah. And
Yeah.
Jones was, sort of had a highborn swagger to him. He claimed to be a planter's son, a wealthy person, but he was obviously intoxicated when he sort of lurched on this boat. As soon as he got on the boat, he went to the saloon that was on board, immediately started drinking more. And then he decided, as the boat started puffing away from Smithland, he decided that he needed a shave and a haircut. So he went to the boat's barber. A lot of these, there are all sorts of sort of accommodations on board these
Yeah.
boats. And he goes to the barber and gets a shave. And he hands the barber a $10 bill. And the barber takes it to the boat's clerk, who's a man named Hiram Stevens. And Stevens looked at the bill and sort of determined that it was counterfeit. And at the time, there was no sort of standardized currency in the United States. I mean, every state sort of had their own banks that were issuing paper money. And when Stevens said that this $10 bill was counterfeit, Jones, the Mississippian, got sort of irritated and then handed a $20 bill over. And when Stevens, the clerk, looked at that bill, he said, "This one's also counterfeit." And when he did this, J.B. Jones, the Mississippian, just flew into a total rage. And he started sort of screaming and cursing, complaining about the boat, complaining about Stevens. And one reporter later said that he did this in the presence of the ladies, which was sort of a terrible insult. And so Stevens, the clerk, basically says to him, "Look, we can discuss this." Grabbed him by the arm and started sort of manhandling him out of the cabin. To Jones, this was a terrible insult. Jones lived under this sort of rubric of Southern honor culture. And one of the tenets of that was, if a lower class person were to put his hands on you, you were supposed to respond immediately. So if one of your equals, another gentleman, insulted you, then you would go through this rigmarole of a challenge to duel. You'd have seconds of friends who would sort of set the duel up, fight that way, and it sort of that was meant to sort of curb passion. That's why people dueled, it was said. But in this instance, this quote unquote lower class clerk ended up manhandling this Mississippian out of the cabin. The Mississippian, Jones, took it as a total insult and immediately pulled a pistol and shot Stevens in the gut. Sadly, it was a fatal wound. It was said that Stevens died in about 15 minutes. Well, as you can imagine, shooting someone on a steamboat, you have nowhere to go once you kill someone. And he was pursued by, passengers and crew who were bound to catch him. And it was said that Jones was in the act of trying to jump overboard to escape when basically the crew members caught him and beat him severely. And they were in the act of, they were about to kill him, in revenge. But passengers ended up stepping in and stopping the crew from killing him. And it was said that there was a famous actress on board named Matilda Heron, who has a really interesting story in her own right. She was sort of famous in the nation. She'd studied in Europe and had become kind of entranced with a play that was written by Alexander Dumas, who's the son of Alexander Dumas, who'd written The Three Musketeers. And it was this play called Camille. And Matilda Heron became sort of entranced with this play. She got it translated. And then she ended up performing it sort of up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and in cities across the U.S. So she was on a tour of this play when this murder took place on board the Ohio Belle. She just happened to be there. It was said that she did this, very emotional appeal to the crew, sort of begging to spare Jones's life. And they ended up, for the time being, sort of saving him. It was said that Matilda Heron actually invented the emotional school of acting, and that people would weep when they saw her portraying Camille, who was this sort of tuberculosis-ridden courtezan who was in the act of dying. And so it was this sort of, one of the first actresses who really used emotion and emoted kind of a role in a very realistic way. So she evidently did this on board the Ohio Belle, and they ended up sort of tying up Jones, tied him from head to toe with a single rope, and bound him to a chair and put him below deck. However, as I mentioned earlier, I discovered this story because a man was found drowned in the Mississippi River tied to a chair. And when the boat's captain, when his wife went to check on Jones later, she found that he had disappeared. And again, several days later, they found Jones bobbing up and down in the river by a sandbar. And so he was obviously, he was murdered then in retribution for the clerk's death by either passengers or likely crew who were on board the Ohio Belle, and it created a big scandal. They tried to have a trial at one point, but no, really, there were no witnesses, and it was just sort of a futile effort to try to sort of punish anyone who was on board the Ohio Belle for that murder. But it was said that the reason they did it is because when they had captured Jones and tied him up, the captain, whose name was John Sebastian, had stopped at different cities along the Mississippi River and had tried to get prosecutors to prosecute him, but they all claimed that they didn't have jurisdiction over the murder. And so the crew was worried that Jones would eventually be set free. There is however, there's a twist in the book where it turns out that Jones really wasn't who he said he was. And even though he was a Mississippian, it turned out he was on the run after doing some other terrible deeds and was living under an assumed name. He was a Mississippian. He was a planter's son. He was very wealthy. But again, he was trying to escape authorities, but instead he sort of met this terrible demise on board the Ohio Belle. So, one thing that readers can learn about is, what is this twist and what did that really entail? But
Hmm.
one thing that I found fascinating, I think a lot of times we think of sort of vigilante justice or extra legal justice rather being a kind of a one-off potentially. But in the mid 1850s, across the Ohio River Valley, this was a lot more common, unfortunately, than one would realize. In Louisville in August of 1855, there was sort of mob rule and terrible riots.
Yeah.
As
Bloody Monday.
Bloody Monday, which was sort of xenophobic riots where
Hmm.
American Party members targeted German and Irish Catholics who, were trying to vote that day. And, dozens perished in Louisville. And,
Hmm.
there were also several trials that ended with riots and, lynchings in Louisville during the same time. A mob also, when one wealthy Kentuckian named Matt Ward was acquitted from a crime. He had shot his brother's teacher. The teacher had sort of struck his brother a few times, and Matt Ward again thought this was an insult to their wealthy family, so he went down and shot the teacher and killed him. And when Matt Ward was acquitted, a mob of Louisville residents were furious and ended up sort of throwing stones and sticks and clubs at the Ward's magnificent home that was located in downtown Louisville and smashing it up. So this kind of vigilante justice and mob rule and mob
Hmm.
mentality was not uncommon in Kentucky during the mid 1850s. And that was sort of something very eye opening to me. Once you start seeing that thread of this happening up and down the Ohio River Valley, then, the crew and the passengers reacting this way was pretty unsurprising. And, it was common during the period on steamboats for a crew to kind of take justice into their own hands. If thieves were found on board, for example, they would get beaten a lot of times. Other times they'd get their head shaved, or both. Or sometimes they were put on islands on the Mississippi River and just sort of left out there with their heads halfway shaved to mark them as being a thief and a criminal. So
Yeah.
it was a bad idea to perpetrate any sort of crime on board a steamboat in the 1850s because you're not only were you risking your life or life or limb, there's a good chance it would happen to you, and passengers sort of accepted it for being what it was.
Well, and was there, I mean, in all honesty though, who was the, jurisdiction of a steamboat that's going down, say Kentucky, but then after it goes down Kentucky, then it's into, Mississippi and Louisiana and all those, who is the jurisdiction? I
Right.
mean, there is, I guess there isn't any. So it is pretty much the up to the crew to settle the problem.
Right. And I think too it was also a business decision in a sense. As I mentioned earlier, boats sort of their reputations were either won or lost by how fast they could get from, these different ports along the river. And I think it was just faster for them instead of sort of, stopping in St. Louis or stopping in Louisville and sort of trying to find authorities and,
Yeah.
doing reports of what happened to the law. It's just easier for them to just sort of handle it themselves, unfortunately. And, they didn't want to waste the time, trying to find authorities or try to find a policeman, whatever it might be, to get an arrest. So instead, they said, "Hey, we know you did it." They beat the heck out of people, and a few times.
Yeah.
The problem is, I mentioned a few of these in the book. I mean, there were times where, of course, they had the wrong person, and they would, beat people, try to get them to admit that they'd done it. And one poor guy, was almost killed. He, they grabbed the wrong person. It wasn't him who had stolen from these passengers. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
again, that's the danger of mob rule and vigilante justice is, there's no system in place where,
Yeah.
people have a fair trial. It's all up to, the people who have the authority and the power at that point. Which is why
Yeah.
our courts are so important today.
Yeah. And that that can get you in trouble. I mean, you better if you're on the steamboat, you better make sure you're
Right.
keeping yourself in line. Oh man, it's a bit wild to think about and I think about you're talking about steamboat. They had steamboat races too, right?
Right. They did. And, sometimes it was simply, it was a race from point A to point B, and they may be an hour or two apart. It's just the
Hmm.
time with which that, they'd make it to the ports. But other times, they were, you know, uh, actually racing fairly close to one another. They'd see a boat coming up on them and, they'd wait for the boat to catch up. Then they would, throw pine knots and tar into the boilers, try to get them going faster, to generate more steam. Yeah, and they would head off down the river. But a lot of times, there were several accidents caused because it's if a pilot was trying to get, let's say, from Cincinnati to St. Louis quickly, but they had to stop in Louisville to pick up more passengers and load and unload freight. It took a lot of time to build up steam in these engines. So what they would do sometimes, when they stopped somewhere, they would keep the steam up, and they would put weights on these pressure release valves that would release the steam if it became too full or at a dangerous level. But they would weigh down these pressure release valves. And so as they were loading passengers on and off, the steam would continue to build. And ideally for these pilots, they would then immediately take off. They wouldn't have to wait for the steam to gather. But what happened a lot of times is because these, boilers were built with either, poor metals, or there was inconsistent strength to the metal, they would simply explode. And it wasn't always, the shrapnel that would kill people or the explosion. It would send steam, going throughout the cabin, and people would breathe in the steam, or literally, it would scald their lungs and kill them. Or, in some instances, there are a few wrecks that are just, and sorry to bring this up, it's pretty terrible stuff, but literally the hot steam would peel the skin off of people. And, I wrote a piece on I think it was in America's Civil War magazine last year, but it was on a Civil War era explosion. There was a boat called the Eclipse that was traveling, I think it was up the Tennessee River, and it had stopped. They were keeping the steam up, and it blew up. And, there were all these poor soldiers who were burned. And there's a surgeon who's sort of throwing flour on their skin to try to sort of provide some sort of comfort. And so just really horrible circumstances on all these accidents. But, really grim, listeners for such a grim topic. It did happen, and really, really terrible things happen on board these steamboats sometimes. But again, steamboats traveled up, in Louisville, for example, until probably the 1920s. There were still some steamboats running up and down the rivers, but railroads eventually came along, and especially after the Civil War, it just was sort of the death knell to steam travel. That's basically what happened to the Ohio Belle. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the boat had an incredible history. And it actually lasted, had about over a 10-year run, which is pretty amazing for a steamboat. Again, most boats only lasted about 5 years. But after the Civil War, it was basically sold off and was renamed the Alabama Belle, and went up and down the Alabama River for a time. But a few years later, they basically just sold it for scrap, unfortunately. So this once magnificent boat had sort of a sad end, an anticlimactic end, at least. But it was, this mode of transport was replaced by railroad, and that's what happened to the boat eventually.
Yeah, and then eventually the railroads got replaced by cars, I guess.
Right, exactly.
And planes. You mentioned too that it ran for both sides during the Civil War. I mean, how that where it just got captured, and they're like, you're with us now.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite parts of the book, and I had never really thought. I've been doing Civil War stuff for 25 years and or longer now, and what I examined in this boat was sort of what was happening along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to trade and travel as during the secession crisis, the states were leaving the Union, and what I found was. There's this sort of game of retribution going on that is states like Arkansas and Tennessee seceded. They all ordered weapons, and a lot of these northern ports would then prevent the weapons from going south. And so in one instance, the Arkansas State Militia had ordered a bunch of cannons. And when those cannons got to Cincinnati, basically Ohio residents confiscated them because they didn't want the seceded state to get more weapons. So the governor of Arkansas ordered that northern-owned boats should then be seized in revenge for these weapons being taken. And sometimes it was violent. In Napoleon, Arkansas, there was a boat called the Westmoreland that stopped. When the local militia showed up to sort of stop the boat, the Westmoreland peeled off, and they actually fired on the boat and ended up killing one passenger who was from Memphis. And when the Ohio Belle reached Napoleon, Arkansas, the militia, scrambled on board and ended up capturing the boat. and it ended up staying in, Confederate service for a while. It was used to transport enslaved African Americans across the river a couple of times. It was a hospital boat. But when the Union forces attacked Island Number 10, and the Confederates realized these boats were going to get captured, they ended up scuttling it. They knocked a hole in it, sent it down the river. But Union steamboat men ended up getting the boat, sort of repairing it. But instead of returning it to its Cincinnati owners, they kept it under Union service for the rest of the war. And, again, it was also a hospital boat. It was a headquarters ship for a while. And in one instance, sort of, highlighting more retribution and sort of revenge and vigilante justice, it transported Union soldiers to a town in Tennessee. And those soldiers actually burned the town completely down in revenge for the town supposedly harbored pro-Confederate guerrillas. So, they only left kind of the local church standing as a reminder that Randolph, Tennessee once stood there. But it's kind of crazy because this theme of retribution and revenge sort of runs through the whole book. And John Sebastian was the boat's captain. And when the boat got seized at Napoleon, Arkansas, he was just furious. And he ended up enlisting in the Union Army and became a gunboat pilot. And he ended up sort of fighting in a couple of river battles, including against the Confederate ram, the Arkansas. And in that battle, he ended up losing his arm. So John Sebastian, the captain of the Ohio Belle, lost his arm in Union service, sort of, taking revenge on the Confederates who'd taken his beloved Ohio Belle. But when the war ended, they ended up, or as the war sort of drew to a close, the Ohio Belle wasn't a super large boat. So the Union Army ended up basically giving some of those smaller boats back to their owners. But it did stay, they contracted with the federal government to sort of carry troops throughout the war, and actually got fired on by pro-Confederate guerrillas a few times too. So, I found the Civil War history of the boats, to me, is just as compelling as the story of the murders on board and the vigilante justice. I mean, the boat had a really kind of crazy history. And, but a thrill I had as a researcher was I actually found a picture of one of the Ohio Belles. The Cincinnati Public Library has an incredible panoramic photograph of the Cincinnati riverfront that was done in 1848. Yeah. And it's basically all these glass plate negatives that they've strung together. And if you go to their website, I mean, you can zoom in, like the amount of detail is incredible. And so I ended up, I was looking for different ship names or boat names, and ended up finding the Ohio Belle. It looks like it looks like it's probably undergoing some sort of repair or refitting. Because it just looks like, like the top cabins have been taken off and things like that. But, I was just shocked to find it. And, finding those things too, then it kind of brings it home. It's like, these boats were more than just sort of mentions in newspaper articles and people's memories. Instead, it was, a real boat with real people. And, photographs like that are kind of a nice reminder of that.
Yeah. Well, it makes it more of a real story, I guess, in a way. How size wise though, how big would you say it was? I mean, people think steamboat now, and like, I'm thinking 2 decks. I don't know, how big was it?
Yeah, it had several decks. The lengthwise, I actually in the book run through the details of the size. I found a great a description of it. I'd have to look it up and read it to you. It's something I didn't commit to memory, unfortunately. But it was sort of judged to be kind of a medium-sized boat that went on the river. But people are super interested. They can find that description on the boat. But I mean, I sort of see steamboats as being kind of a great social equalizer, because there are all sorts of people on board, whether it was politicians or soldiers. Again, famous actresses like Matilda Heron. You had gamblers, you had thieves, you had criminals. You had the sort of immigrants on steamboats who were traveling farther west. Really, steamboats were the linchpin of Western expansion in the United States. Really, as immigrants got on board and traveled the rivers to go farther west. I mean, people of every class, every job, every description, every race, color, creed, ended up traveling steamboats at some point. And it's again, I see this sort of the great societal equalizer. However, it showed sort of class differences were still real at the time, because depending on what you could afford, gave you different accommodations. So a lot of times, poorer people would either buy what was called a deck ticket, where they'd actually sleep up on the deck exposed to the elements, or others would sleep down sort of in the depths of the steamboat, where pigs and cattle and chickens were kept. So, those were the cheapest tickets.
I'm not
Yeah.
even thinking of having, farm animals and stuff on there as well, but
Oh
that
gosh,
probably was the case.
horses. Yeah, I mean, it's some of the steamboat explosions talk about that too, because there were a few times there were some famous racehorses, or well, not famous necessarily, but some like well-regarded racehorses that had
Mhm.
you know, uh, really good progeny were actually on board boats that exploded, and so it was a business loss for those thoroughbred horse breeders.
Mhm.
And those were noted. The sad part is like a lot of times the passengers were unknown who were killed, or a lot of times slaves worked on board these vessels. They were sort of leased out to be either cooks or barbers or chefs or just sort of porters carrying stuff around.
Mhm.
And their names are all lost to history, sadly. I mean, white newspapers just didn't record the names
Yeah.
more often than not. It would just say sort of like seamstress, age 16 was killed, and that would be about it for a lot of these
Yeah.
African Americans who were killed on board. But again, sadly, the horse names were sometimes recorded, and then the people were not, and
Yeah.
it was just sort of it showed how people were valued during that time, really.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, and I read somewhere where it said that, as far as tickets goes, you can get a deck ticket, but then if you wanted like a blanket and pillow, you had to pay so much for that. I
Right,
mean, just
right,
think it blows my mind to think, I got this deck ticket. I can either just sleep on the deck or pay a
right.
little extra money and get a blanket.
Yeah, so
Uh,
it's like be thankful that your airline peanuts are covered in the cost, I guess. It's sort
yeah.
of like, yeah, because I mean, it's like any business. They're sort of nickel and diming passengers any way they can, and but again, people clamored for the boats that were seen to be the fastest, and
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, tickets cost different prices, but most people wanted to be in the cabins. Also, too, the deck passengers a lot of times were riding over the boilers of the boat, and so when there was an accident or an explosion, the poorer passengers tended to be the ones that incurred the more casualties. So you had a greater risk too
Mhm.
of being a deck passenger just because of where you were riding on board the boat. So a lot of times the
Yeah.
cabin passengers would survive. And one important thing to know too, most people didn't know how to swim during this time. It wasn't like
Oh
people
yeah.
went to a YMCA and took swimming lessons. It was very rare for people to know, or rarer than it is today for people to know how to swim. So, if your boat was on fire and sinking in the middle of a river, you had to make this terrible decision: do I stay on board and perish in the flames, or do I jump in and likely drown? And so in
Yeah.
most instances, of course, people jumped off trying to cling on to parts of the vessel that were, like a
Mhm.
lot of times the shutters and rooms were meant to be flotation devices in a sense. And, people would try to, clamber onto driftwood or doors, things like that.
Mhm.
And so these
But
accounts are really sad too, of, another boat would pull up sort of right after an explosion and try to, fish people out of the water. And, there'd be they were called yawls, YAWL, small boats that were kind of like a life raft that would go out and try to
mhm.
pull people. A lot of times, those would get overturned as well as people tried to get on board. So, it's pretty
Well,
sad,
yeah.
all these sad stories. So
Well,
it's really, yeah, sorry, I'm
well,
getting so grim about all this stuff. But it's just,
that's all
it
right.
was, it was just part of the travel at the time,
Yeah.
and something we
I
don't
I
think
was
about today.
I was thinking, back whenever you were talking before about, the guy trying to jump over, they were trying to catch him and jump over, and I was thinking, well, he can just jump over and swim. That's no big deal. And then
Right,
thinking, well, they leave him on an island in the middle of the river. Well, that person just swam to the other side, but
right.
not if any of them can swim.
No, no, and I found a
Yeah.
couple of accounts too. I was sort of as I was researching the book, I found some accounts of it was a man. I think I mentioned this in the book, but one man stabbed another and killed him, and he jumped overboard to try to escape,
Mhm.
justice, and ended up drowning. And so that happened a
Yeah.
lot too, where these killers who were trying to escape, justice from the crew, they ended up themselves passing away because they just couldn't swim and drowned. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
again, it's um, alcohol on board and concealed weapons. It's never a good combination. So you have
Yeah.
gambling, alcohol, and concealed weapons that would, cause these sort of spontaneous acts of
Mhm.
violence and murder on board a lot of these boats. So
And kind of a Wild West on the river there,
yeah,
anything can
yep,
happen, and
yep, exactly. And
vigilante
again,
justice, all that.
right. And most of these the men went around armed. If they didn't have a pistol, they had a Bowie knife, and or a lot of times, arguments between crew would end in homicide where, firemen were on the boat, and these were the guys who were basically throwing wood into the fire. They usually use wood, as fuel. There was an argument one time, and one fireman hit another guy with a stick of firewood and ended up killing him. So, there were murders perpetrated between crew members, between passengers, and, in the instance of the Ohio Belle, between, this Mississippian and the boat's clerk. So I kind of run through some of the other murders, just kind of providing context of the fact that, these were not idyllic, scenes all the time. It was sometimes, they were rife with violence.
Yeah, geez. So you think I should title this episode
Happy stuff.
yeah, yeah. Doom and gloom on the river.
Yeah, gosh, pretty much. Yeah, sorry to be such a downer. But I mean, to me, it's just fascinating because it's kind of a reflection of, antebellum society in general. And that's what I think is so interesting about it, because it's kind of like, when you look at a steamboat and the passengers on board a steamboat, it's kind of taking at least the Ohio River Valley, kind of in microcosm, and sort of, putting it on a petri dish in a sense, but instead it's a steamboat, kind of looking at it through a microscope. And, you can learn a lot more about kind of these themes of that existed in American history at the time.
Well, I was going to say, I think of Kentucky history, that antebellum time frame is, I think a lot of people overlook it a lot. They want to talk about the Civil War or maybe the frontiersmen at the beginning, but that middle part is a lot of good stuff, a lot of development of the country. I mean, and Kentucky is in a way kind of in the midst of the center of all that as well.
Exactly. And, I've really, I've spent most of my career, looking at the Civil War. I started at Perryville, worked for the Battlefield Preservation Association, and have written a couple of books on Perryville, one on Mill Springs, that battle. And, so I've been sort of focused on 1861 to 65, but like, this book, The Ohio Belle, really got me a lot more interested in the 1850s. And 1850s Kentucky is just completely, just fascinating to me. I mean, from the high end of politics of, Henry Clay and the Whig Party to, again, these sort of, murders that took place in the streets, or, political violence. I mean, it's just, if you open up any newspaper from Kentucky in the 1850s, you're going to find something that's completely fascinating that, illuminates something else about America's broader history. And, you can tell how, arguments over runaway freedom-seeking slaves, for example, who've crossed the Ohio River, into Ohio, and sort of the fugitive slave laws. I mean, you can really see how the foundations for the Civil War was really laid during that period, and how Kentucky played such a crucial part in all of that. So, if anybody's interested in, doing any sort of research into Kentucky history at all, or if, a college student needs a topic for a paper, I mean, just get on, Chronicling America, which is a free site through the Library of Congress, or get a newspapers.com subscription, or, go to a microfilm copy of a newspaper, just start digging into the mid to late 1850s. And, within 20 minutes, you'll find enough topics to, keep you busy for a lifetime.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that's the way it goes, find you a good rabbit hole and run down it.
Right.
Get lost in it.
Right. Exactly.
So where can people get the book and all that?
Yeah, I mean, they're available online, like at Amazon. You can also buy them directly from the University Press of Kentucky, who published it. So, other online booksellers sell it as well. I know I'm always a huge fan of local bookstores. So if you're in Lexington, Joseph Beth's, for example, usually has a copy or two as well. So, people are interested in it. It's available online or in bookstores too.
Thanks again for joining us again. Again, it was a little dark.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
A little dark, but it's okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sometimes history is.
Yeah, but it's just, again, when you're looking at 1850 steamboats, you're going to come across these accidents, and unfortunately, it happened more often than we'd like to think. So it was just part of the travel at the time.
Yeah. Well, and just, I mean, it's interesting enough. It's like a lot of those things. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about that would be a problem, but I mean, those are things that happen, and kind of one of those things you learn as I'm sure they learned as they go to figure out how to fix those problems. But again, the almighty time is ticking away, so they got to get to their destination.
Right. Yeah.
Again, when the new book comes out, we'll have to come back on and talk a little bit about
Sounds
it.
great.
Some duels. I mean, that sounds well just as dark and gloomy, but
Right. Yeah, I know. I know. Unfortunately, lately I've been stuck on these, sort of darker and gloomier topics, but it's, Kentucky especially, I mean, how violence was applied in the state from, before the Civil War through into the Gilded Age, 1880s, was and even beyond in the early 20th
yeah,
century is just pretty fascinating. And a lot of times concealed weapons were used in numerous street battles and
oh yeah,
kind of informal duels that went on after the Civil War too. But
yeah,
these kind of formal duels are pretty fascinating, and every community sort of had that happen. And some are more famous than others, and some were fought over ridiculous reasons, and um, and some were fought for more serious reasons. So, like, there was
yeah.
an argument over a dog, for example, that caused one
Oh
duel in
gosh.
Franklin County, or one man killed another's dog, so they ended up having a duel. There's one story that in Bardstown, two wealthy men argued over who had a better mastery over ancient languages, and that ended up causing a duel. In
Oh.
Lexington, yeah, two doctors got in an argument over over a post-mortem examination, and
Hmm.
who's going to have sort of authority of that. And one of the doctors ended up dueling another doctor kind of related to that, and shot the man, severed an artery near his groin, and then ended up sort of saving the man's life, because he was a doctor. So, there are countless just fascinating tales related to dueling in Kentucky. And
Oh
that's
well.
been a fun one to dig into, and that book should be out again in November of this
I
year.
don't. I don't know if I'm more intrigued that two people dueled over knowing the best ancient language, or the fact that
Right.
two people just knew ancient language in the middle of
Right.
Kentucky.
I know. Yeah, and well, but again, like Kentucky, Lexington used to be the Athens of the West, for example, and
Mm,
so
yeah.
it was. I think if a well-educated, there were pockets of
Oh yeah.
well-educated population during that period, of course, but again, I think alcohol. They were playing cards, and I think alcohol got in the way, and then once a challenge was given, it sort of
You can't.
took on a life of
You
its
can't.
own. So a lot
Yeah.
of times, even if people wanted to avert it, they wouldn't end the duel because then they'd be accused of being a coward. So if you
Mm.
boxed yourself in and ended up having a challenge or giving a challenge, it was really hard to get out of it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the sad part about a lot of these duels. That we had men who, well, like Andrew Jackson dueled a guy named Dickinson, ended up killing him, and they dragged on the negotiations of that duel for about 6 months because probably neither man wanted to do it, but kind of the societal pressure, ended up
Have
creeping
to go
in.
through
So,
it. Yeah.
again, we have United States presidents who killed men in duels who were then
Yeah.
elected president. So, sort of incomprehensible today, I think, to think of. But, again, it's what makes U.S. history and Kentucky history in particular so interesting.
Yep. Yep. Well, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.